What if the biggest rival Hamilton faced in Monaco was not on the track, but inside his own team? While Leclerc enjoyed the best parts and upgrades, Hamilton was left to fight with leftovers, and still managed to shine. Is Ferrari protecting their favorite driver at the cost of fairness? Or is this just another example of how bias and politics quietly decide who really wins in Formula One? On the 25th of May, 2025, the world of Formula One found itself captivated not by podiums or pole positions, but by a story of resilience that unfolded in the narrow, unforgiving streets of Montecarlo. It was the incredible comeback of Hamilton after his terrible qualifying in Monaco that dominated headlines across the globe. The weekend began with what many labeled a disaster for Hamilton, who faced one of the worst qualifying results of his career. Despite stable weather and a clean track, he struggled to extract performance from his car, which appeared unbalanced and unpredictable through low-speed corners. Frustration built quickly as he failed to advance beyond the initial qualifying stages, leaving him buried deep in the starting grid. A nightmare scenario in a circuit where overtaking is notoriously rare. Paddock whispers soon turned to speculation, not just about setup errors or driver form, but about deeper issues within the Ferrari team. Technical insiders hinted at internal tensions, suggesting that some of the best components, such as new aerodynamic updates and revised suspension parts, were consistently fitted to Leclerc's car, while Hamilton was left with less optimal equipment. Although team management publicly claimed both drivers had equal machinery, telemetry data told a different story. Analysts noted inconsistencies in rear stability and corner exit speed in Hamilton's car that were absent in Leclerc's. The implication was clear. The tools provided to both drivers may not have been as equal as Ferrari insisted. Yet, what followed on Sunday turned disappointment into inspiration. Against all odds, Hamilton delivered a performance that reminded the world why he remains one of the most respected and accomplished drivers in Formula One history. Through flawless racecraft, strategic brilliance, and sheer determination, he began to climb up the order, carving through the field with precise, risk-managed overtakes. The crowd watched in awe as he found grip and confidence in sections of the track where others hesitated, turning a weekend that had started in frustration into a demonstration of elite-level resilience and skill. What made Hamilton's incredible comeback after his terrible qualifying in Monaco even more extraordinary was not simply his rise through the field, but the calculated manner in which he dismantled the challenge ahead of him. From the first lap, it was clear that Hamilton was not resigned to merely salvaging a few points. In a place where strategy usually determines success more than raw pace, he adopted an approach that was aggressive, but never reckless. He studied his rivals carefully, identifying weaknesses in their lines, their braking points, and even their tire wear. In a circuit where every inch matters, he executed overtakes that seemed impossible, each one surgically precise, each one carrying the weight of a driver who refused to be written off. The turning point came during a virtual safety car period. While Ferrari chose a conservative approach for Leclerc, keeping him out on aging hard tires, Hamilton made a bold decision. He switched to a set of used medium compounds that still had enough life to push aggressively. It was a move questioned by some on the pit wall at the time, but one that proved decisive. With warmer tires and cleaner air ahead, he began to deliver purple sectors, shaving seconds off his gap to the midfield. His race pace exceeded expectations, and even with tire degradation factored in, he maintained consistency that baffled rival engineers. It was a masterclass in tire management, rhythm, and mental focus. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, quiet conversations turned into louder concerns about internal imbalance within the team. Several retired engineers and former insiders pointed out irregularities in how updates were distributed between the two drivers. One of the most controversial moments occurred when only Leclerc's car received Ferrari's newly developed floor upgrade, a part known to offer significant downforce improvements. Although the team claimed supply limitations, to many observers it seemed like yet another sign of favoritism. Cameras even caught moments of visible discomfort among mechanics in the Ferrari garage, where tension between different sides of the garage was becoming increasingly hard to ignore. Despite these undercurrents, Hamilton remained composed. He let his driving do the talking. His calm demeanor after the race, coupled with a sharp, focused look in his eyes, sent a clear message. Greatness does not need perfect conditions. It thrives in adversity. International media praised the performance not as a victory in numbers, but as a triumph of spirit. In Monaco, where history is carved not only by those who win but by those who endure, Hamilton's drive became a new chapter in the legend of perseverance. As the dust settled in Montecarlo, Hamilton's incredible comeback after his terrible qualifying in Monaco began to take on a deeper significance, not just as a single race performance, but as a statement. Within the walls of Ferrari's garage, conversations grew more complicated. The disparity in technical support between the two drivers, long suspected by close observers, was no longer just a quiet rumor passed between journalists and insiders. It had become a visible pattern. Over the course of the season, several small decisions, rarely addressed publicly, had accumulated into a larger picture. From differential software updates that arrived late to Hamilton's side, to priority given to Leclerc for experimental aero parts during practice sessions, a subtle but consistent imbalance had emerged. While some within the team defended these choices as performance-based decisions, or the result of logistical constraints, many felt that they hinted at something more systemic, an internal culture leaning too heavily toward one driver, at the expense of the other. Yet, what truly elevated Hamilton's performance in Monaco was the way he chose to respond. There were no outbursts, no passive-aggressive statements to the press, no cryptic social media posts hinting at sabotage or dissatisfaction. Instead, there was focus, cold, measured, and relentless. He approached the race not as a victim of internal politics, but as a competitor with something to prove, not to others, but to himself. The trust he placed in his own instincts, in his understanding of tire behavior, track evolution, and car dynamics, allowed him to execute an overtaking strategy in Monaco that bordered on impossible. In fact, some of his passes were so well-timed and smooth that commentators questioned whether they were watching live action or a replay of past highlights. He had transformed what should have been a frustrating and forgettable Sunday into a masterwork of racing discipline. Technically speaking, Hamilton's telemetry data from the race tells a story that words cannot fully express. Analysts noted that his throttle application was significantly smoother compared to other drivers fighting through traffic, indicating not only skill, but mechanical sympathy, an understanding of how to treat a machine that is not at its best. His braking patterns showed extraordinary consistency, even as he adjusted his lines to respond to the unpredictable movements of cars ahead. Most revealing of all was the way he managed temperatures in his tires and brakes, two of the most difficult aspects to control in Monaco, especially when stuck in dirty air for most of the race. Somehow, he kept everything within the optimal operating window while pushing hard enough to climb the order. It was the kind of driving that can only be described as intuitive, the result of years at the absolute peak of the sport. Off track, the aftermath of the race stirred a mixture of admiration and quiet discomfort within Ferrari. While fans and commentators around the world celebrated Hamilton's tenacity, inside the team, some feared that the spotlight would now expose the fractures they had tried to hide. Several well-respected former team principals, speaking on post-race broadcasts, openly questioned Ferrari's current structure. When you have a multiple-time world champion in your garage, you do not treat him as a number two, one said. You give him the tools to win, or you risk wasting a legend's final years. It was a sentiment echoed across social media, where fans who once believed in the romantic dream of Hamilton and Ferrari conquering the world together now voiced doubts about whether that vision was ever truly shared by the team. And yet, Hamilton never faltered in public. After the race, his interviews remained calm, thoughtful, and characteristically measured. He thanked the team, spoke positively about the effort from the mechanics, and deflected questions about strategy discrepancies. But those who know him well recognized the coded language beneath the surface. The way he emphasized, "We did the best with what we had," or "There is always more to understand." These were not accidental phrases. They were subtle acknowledgments of a driver fully aware of the circumstances surrounding him, yet determined not to let politics break his focus. In that sense, his performance was not just a comeback. It was a quiet rebellion delivered not with words, but with perfect, unanswerable driving. The narrative surrounding Hamilton's incredible comeback after his terrible qualifying in Monaco continued to evolve in the days following the race, expanding far beyond the result sheet. It was no longer simply a question of whether one driver had outperformed expectations. It had become a mirror reflecting the broader tensions within the Ferrari organization, an iconic team caught between its past glories, its present contradictions, and an uncertain future. Within Formula One, where perception often shapes reality, the weight of Hamilton's performance began to force difficult questions onto the team's leadership. How could one of the most decorated drivers in history find himself consistently deprived of competitive machinery, while his teammate, Leclerc, appeared to receive technical preferences race after race? Was this merely coincidence, or the manifestation of a deeper, unspoken hierarchy within the team? To the public, Ferrari maintained its polished image. Statements from senior engineers emphasized parity between the drivers, highlighting unified development goals and shared strategic intentions. But insiders spoke of a different reality. According to multiple well-placed sources within the paddock, there has been growing friction in technical meetings. While Hamilton reportedly remains professional and composed, his requests for specific setup directions or experimental parts have allegedly been delayed or deprioritized. On more than one occasion, data requested by his side of the garage, especially concerning tire degradation trends and wind tunnel simulations, arrived late or incomplete, while Leclerc's crew received the full set of resources in real time. These asymmetries, while difficult to prove from the outside, have become impossible to ignore for those closely tracking the internal dynamics of the team. And yet, it is precisely in this atmosphere of quiet resistance that Hamilton's brilliance shines brighter. The Monaco performance was not just a race, it was an act of defiance, an answer to the doubts, the politics, and the whispered agendas. While other drivers might have crumbled under the weight of mechanical disadvantage and institutional neglect, Hamilton elevated his craft. Every decision he made on track was laced with intention. Lifting early to preserve fuel where others burned it, braking late but cleanly to minimize tire stress, defending just enough to hold position while plotting his next attack. He played a game of chess at 200 kilometers per hour, anticipating rivals' mistakes before they made them, all while managing a machine that, by most internal accounts, was not functioning at peak configuration. The ability to transcend machinery with sheer driving intuition is something that only a handful in the sport's history have ever possessed. In Monaco, Hamilton reminded everyone that he is firmly among them. Beyond the technical and strategic marvels of that Sunday afternoon, there was also a psychological battle at play, one that revealed as much about Ferrari as it did about Hamilton. For a driver to remain committed, motivated, and focused in an environment where trust is eroding is a rare feat throughout the weekend. Subtle signs of division within the team became visible to the keen eye. Body language in the garage shifted. Mechanics from Hamilton's side worked with quiet intensity, rarely interacting with their counterparts across the garage. During media sessions, Leclerc appeared relaxed, his answers free of tension, while Hamilton chose his words with precision, often pausing before responding to avoid feeding speculation. The contrast was striking, and it painted a picture of a team divided not just by roles or results, but by philosophy. The media frenzy that followed was intense. Major sports outlets praised Hamilton's race as one of the finest examples of mental toughness in modern Formula One. Editorials dissected his laps frame by frame, noting how he extracted every last bit of performance from corners where other drivers hesitated. Commentators began to speculate openly about his future with the team, some suggesting that a move to another project might become inevitable if the situation at Ferrari continued to deteriorate. But Hamilton, ever the strategist, avoided escalating the discourse. He understood that every word, every gesture would be magnified. Instead, he continued to focus on the one thing no team politics could take from him: the ability to drive like no one else on the grid. As the days passed and the glow of Hamilton's incredible comeback after his terrible qualifying in Monaco began to settle into the collective memory of the paddock, its deeper implications only grew more apparent. What had initially seemed like an isolated moment of individual brilliance was now being recognized as a pivotal chapter in the unfolding drama within Ferrari, a team whose historical prestige has often masked the instability beneath. For many observers, Hamilton's drive through the streets of Montecarlo had become a symbol of what happens when greatness is placed in imperfect circumstances. In a sport where millimeters and milliseconds separate success from failure, the psychological burden of driving with one hand tied behind your back, knowing your own team may not be fully behind you, would crush most competitors. But Hamilton, ever the craftsman, did not just endure that burden, he transformed it into performance. The telemetry analysts working for neutral broadcasters were the first to piece together the complete scope of what Hamilton achieved. In a side-by-side comparison of his race pace versus Leclerc's, a surprising trend emerged. Despite starting several positions behind and being held up in traffic for nearly half the race, Hamilton's lap times were, on average, within 1/10 of his teammates. In clean air, he was faster. On worn tires, he was more consistent. When asked to push, he pushed. When asked to save, he saved. The data painted a picture not of a struggling veteran past his prime, but of a strategic master still capable of operating at the highest echelon of performance. This contradicted many of the narratives that had started to form earlier in the season: that Hamilton was losing his edge, that Ferrari had perhaps bet on the wrong horse. In truth, Monaco revealed that the problem had never been the driver. It was the environment. Whispers around the paddock now spoke more openly of favoritism. Insiders pointed to a pattern in Ferrari's upgrade path. The new floor introduced at Imola, which offered a crucial gain in low-speed downforce, had originally been promised to both drivers. But logistical delays, reportedly due to supply chain bottlenecks, meant only one unit was ready for the race. It went to Leclerc. At the time, Hamilton offered no complaint. But since then, similar delays have mysteriously continued to affect only one side of the garage. New barge boards, revised rear wings, brake cooling modifications. All of them seem to appear on Leclerc's car first. Ferrari denied any strategic favoritism, claiming performance-based deployment and real-time calibration data guided their decisions. But to fans, journalists, and even rival teams, the trend was too blatant to ignore. And yet, despite all of this, Hamilton never broke character. He remained the professional, the champion, the quiet architect of his own story. In post-race interviews, he spoke in clipped but carefully chosen phrases, expressing gratitude to the team while subtly acknowledging the challenges. "We are working through some things," he said, when asked about the car's behavior. "I have full faith in the crew on my side of the garage." But behind those words was a deeper message. He knew what was happening, and he had chosen not to respond with complaints or accusations, but with pure performance. This choice, of silence over conflict, of composure over chaos, is perhaps what made his Monaco drive so emotionally resonant. It was a reminder that in a sport increasingly defined by politics and power structures, there is still room for purity of purpose. As the team packed up and left Montecarlo, there was an unspoken tension in the air. Ferrari had narrowly avoided a total public relations disaster by keeping both cars in the points. But internally, the mood was more fractured than ever. Some mechanics on Hamilton's side felt demoralized, watching their driver outperform with less. Engineers quietly questioned why feedback from his simulations was routinely discarded. Morale was splintering, and everyone could feel it. Meanwhile, Hamilton, as he has done so many times before, carried the weight of it all with poise. Knowing that every lap he turned, every fan he inspired, every rival he humbled with his quiet brilliance, was a quiet protest against the very system that tried to limit him. In the weeks that followed Hamilton's incredible comeback after his terrible qualifying in Monaco, the aftershocks of that race continued to ripple through the paddock, the media, and most notably, the Ferrari headquarters in Maranello. What had been whispered before became now an unavoidable conversation. The notion that one of the greatest drivers in the history of the sport was operating under conditions that seemed engineered to stifle rather than support his excellence ignited widespread discourse. Not only about fairness, but about legacy. For Hamilton, whose move to Ferrari had been framed as a historic union between two icons, the dream was beginning to clash with the reality of internal politics, unspoken biases, and a team structure that, whether intentionally or not, had cast him into a secondary role. The symbolic weight of Monaco, a circuit that demands perfection and punishes complacency, was the perfect setting for this truth to be exposed. As journalists revisited the footage, the strategy calls, and the pit-to-car radio communications from the race, more questions emerged. Why had Hamilton not been brought in earlier for a tire change during the first virtual safety car, when the data showed clear gains in track position were possible? Why had his race engineer hesitated in confirming his preference for the medium compound, a tire compound that Hamilton himself had been asking for since lap 12? Why had certain telemetry feeds that would allow him to adjust energy deployment in traffic suddenly stopped working, only to be restored several laps later, coincidentally after the window for an undercut had passed? While no accusation of sabotage was made publicly, the pattern of unexplained missteps and strategic indecision continued to raise suspicion. Meanwhile, former champions, veteran engineers, and retired team principals began to speak out. Many pointed out that Hamilton's situation was not without precedent. History has shown that when Formula One teams develop emotional or political attachments to a particular driver, it can shift the entire operational dynamic. In Ferrari's case, Leclerc, having grown up in the Ferrari Driver Academy and often seen as the chosen son of Maranello, had long enjoyed a kind of institutional protection. This created an environment where internal loyalty became a factor in decision-making, even when logic and merit demanded neutrality. It was, in many ways, the same trap that had ensnared Ferrari in past eras, most notably during the final years of Fernando Alonso's tenure, when internal dysfunction undermined the performance of the entire team. But through all of this, Hamilton remained unshaken. In private, according to those close to him, he remained fully engaged. He continued to spend long hours in the simulator, debriefed with forensic intensity, and worked closely with data analysts to understand even the smallest weaknesses in his car. He refused to become the victim. He refused to allow frustration to slow him down. Instead, he channeled it, quietly and efficiently, into preparation. Monaco was not a miracle, one of his senior engineers reportedly told a motorsport outlet. It was the result of him doing more with less. And when you see a driver do that consistently, you cannot ignore it anymore. He is outperforming the car, the strategy, and the support structure around him. That should scare everyone. Fans around the world certainly took notice. Social media platforms erupted with analysis, appreciation, and mounting pressure on Ferrari. A movement began to form, not one led by outrage or tribalism, but by admiration. Thousands of fans, many of whom had followed Hamilton since his debut in 2007, rallied behind him with renewed intensity. Hashtags calling for equal treatment trended across countries. Memes spread, not mocking the team, but honoring Hamilton's grace under fire. Video montages of his Monaco overtakes were set to orchestral music, painting him as a gladiator battling not just his rivals, but the very system meant to support him. His comeback had become more than just a race result. It had become a parable, a story of defiance told through tire smoke and apex precision. At Ferrari, the leadership found itself in a dilemma. To continue on the same path risked alienating one of the sport's most marketable and respected drivers. But to shift their internal culture, one that had long favored in-house loyalty over performance equity, meant confronting uncomfortable truths. Internally, debates grew more intense. Some argued that Leclerc was the future, and that the team's investments needed to center around him. Others, however, pointed out that Hamilton, even in a politically unfriendly environment, was producing results that Leclerc could not replicate. If anything, Monaco had made one thing perfectly clear. The difference between the two was not just in machinery, but in mindset. One was driving with the full weight of team support. The other was driving with something even more powerful, conviction. By the time the Formula One world turned its attention to the next stop on the calendar, Hamilton's incredible comeback after his terrible qualifying in Monaco had solidified into more than a memorable performance. It had become a turning point. The narrative surrounding Ferrari was no longer dictated solely by lap times, podiums, or constructors' standings. It was now deeply entangled with questions of ethics, transparency, and the treatment of excellence within a system that appeared selectively blind to it. Inside the Ferrari compound, behind the red-painted walls and layers of corporate silence, a reckoning had begun. Internal reviews were launched. Department heads were called into closed-door meetings. The data from Monaco was dissected not for performance analysis, but to understand how the team had allowed such an unmistakable imbalance to become visible on the world stage. And at the center of it all, Hamilton, calm and unwavering, went back to work, because for him, the story was far from over. There was a subtle power in how he carried himself in the days that followed. No bitterness, no retaliation, just an unspoken message that resonated far louder than any press release. I will drive through whatever you put in front of me. That mindset, the refusal to be defined by circumstances, echoed through the corridors of Formula One's most influential circles. Sponsors began to take notice. While some had aligned their brand messaging closely with Leclerc, viewing him as the fresh, loyal face of Ferrari's future, others saw in Hamilton a more enduring and global symbol. A man who represented not just speed and talent, but resilience, composure, and integrity. Conversations began behind the scenes, as major corporate partners questioned whether the team was honoring the spirit of competition or simply reinforcing internal favoritism behind a veneer of unity. Meanwhile, those within Ferrari who had always admired Hamilton's presence, engineers, strategists, and junior staff who had once watched his championship battles from afar, now began to speak more freely. Whispers turned into quiet admissions. That setup suggestions from Hamilton were often more accurate, that his understanding of tire evolution over race stints had saved the team points multiple times, that his adaptability during wet-dry conditions had bailed out flawed strategies. These acknowledgments weren't loud or revolutionary, but they marked the start of something critical. Respect being voiced inside a system that had until then operated under selective appreciation. Back in the simulator, Hamilton was relentless. He dove into telemetry, not out of obligation, but out of hunger. He studied not only his own data, but also comparative laps between himself and his teammate. He poured through the differences in throttle traces, braking points, steering angles, and tire degradation curves. What he found only validated what many suspected: that despite often running outdated components, suboptimal aerodynamic packages, or receiving delayed setup updates, he was still consistently able to match or outperform Leclerc. It was a data-backed truth, undeniable and irrefutable, and Hamilton knew how powerful that truth would become if revealed at the right moment. And yet, even with all this ammunition, Hamilton chose a different path. He did not leak. He did not retaliate. He did not engage in passive-aggressive digs in front of the cameras. Instead, he did something infinitely more damaging to the system that sought to contain him. He kept showing up and delivering. Every practice lap was precise. Every media appearance was measured. Every message to the team, even when layered with deeper meaning, was laced with respect. It was a kind of quiet rebellion, one that did not need anger to make its point. His very presence, prepared, focused, and undeterred, became a challenge to the status quo. Because nothing threatens a biased system more than a man who refuses to break under it. Beyond the garage, the global fanbase had fully realigned. Monaco had reignited memories of Hamilton's greatest comebacks, from his early days with McLaren to the title fights with Rosberg and Verstappen. But this was different. This was not just about speed, it was about grace under pressure, dignity under doubt. Fans began organizing tribute videos, podcast retrospectives, and panel discussions that framed his Monaco drive as one of the most emotionally resonant moments of his career. Influential figures from outside the motorsport world, athletes, musicians, activists, began referencing his performance as an example of how to confront injustice without becoming consumed by it. Hamilton had become not just a driver again, but a movement. Within Ferrari, this movement could no longer be ignored. team principal meetings grew tenser. Some advocated for restructuring the technical support divisions to ensure equal treatment. Others warned that changing too much would alienate Leclerc and destabilize a driver they still saw as the long-term investment. But a few, the most forward-thinking among them, posed a simple yet haunting question. What if we are not building around the wrong driver, but losing the right one? That question, still unanswered, now loomed over every debrief, every strategy call, and every executive conversation. As the Formula One season progressed beyond the haze of Hamilton's incredible comeback after his terrible qualifying in Monaco, it became clear that the echoes of that performance were not just lingering, they were evolving. What had begun as an on-track masterclass, a defiant act of brilliance in the face of engineered adversity, was now transforming into a seismic shift in the way both the sport and the team of Ferrari perceived greatness. The Monaco weekend had become more than a race. It was a mirror held up to the faces of those who had long preferred comfort over confrontation, favoritism over fairness, and legacy over truth. And in that mirror, the image that stared back at them was no longer one of a fractured team, but of a fractured belief system. One where internal politics had blinded them to the extraordinary resilience of a driver whose entire career had been a study in overcoming invisible odds. Hamilton, now moving through the paddock with a silent intensity, was no longer just a competitor. He had become a living symbol of something more enduring than pole positions or podiums. His actions had made people reflect, not only within Ferrari but across the paddock, on what true leadership looks like in a system designed to reward compliance. He did not demand equal treatment through interviews or tantrums. He earned it by exposing the imbalance in the most devastating way possible, by delivering results no one could ignore. Every point he scored, every position he gained, became another crack in the walls of favoritism that had been quietly built around him since his arrival in Maranello. And those walls, now visibly crumbling, were not falling from external pressure, but from the weight of truth itself. The team dynamic at Ferrari was no longer the same. Engineers who had once quietly followed the line began asking tougher questions. Why was this package delayed for his car again? Why is the feedback from his side being deprioritized? The hierarchy that once felt untouchable now showed signs of uncertainty. Leadership, once confident in the narrative they had shaped around Leclerc as the future, began to realize that they had underestimated the power of history. Because Hamilton was not just another hire. He was a man who had rewritten what was possible in Formula One, who had inspired a generation far beyond motorsport, and who had come to Ferrari not to play a role, but to leave a legacy. And Monaco had proved he was still very much capable of doing just that. In press conferences, the questions became more pointed. Journalists stopped dancing around the truth and began calling it by name. Is there a reason why strategic calls consistently disadvantage Hamilton? Why are car upgrades arriving late on one side of the garage? The answers, previously vague and filled with corporate deflection, began to falter. The pressure was no longer external. It was now coming from within. Former Ferrari legends, who had once remained neutral, began speaking out. Some warned that the team was in danger of repeating the same mistakes that had cost them decades of dominance. Others, more blunt, stated outright that if Ferrari failed to recognize and respect Hamilton's contribution, they did not deserve him. Through it all, Hamilton never once claimed to be a victim. That was never his way. Instead, he did what he had always done. He adapted, evolved, and elevated. He returned to the factory between races with more determination than ever. He worked with his mechanics, though still loyal to him despite the imbalance, and pushed the simulator team to extremes. He studied race tapes from past decades, looking not for inspiration but for overlooked details. Because Hamilton knew something the rest were only starting to understand. Legacy is not built by what is given, but by what is endured and overcome. And if Ferrari had made the mistake of thinking he had come here to retire quietly, Monaco had shattered that illusion beyond repair. As the curtain slowly began to fall on the first half of the season, the sport found itself gripped by a quiet tension. Would Ferrari change course and support both drivers equally? Would Hamilton's quiet defiance ignite a cultural shift from within? Or would this season, like so many before it, become another chapter in the long saga of Ferrari's inner conflicts? Whatever the answer, one thing was now undeniable. Hamilton's drive in Monaco was not just a comeback, it was a declaration. A reminder that greatness does not ask for permission. It creates its own place, even in the most hostile of environments. And no matter what came next, the world would remember what happened that Sunday in Montecarlo. Not because of who was favored, but because of who rose despite not being. That day, Hamilton did not just fight for position, he fought for truth. And in doing so, he became something even Ferrari could no longer control, undeniable. Though Hamilton's incredible comeback after his terrible qualifying in Monaco had, by all structural definitions, concluded with the waving of the checkered flag, its true impact refused to be contained by dates or race results. It had become part of a much larger narrative, one that transcended the confines of pit lanes and paddocks. Monaco was no longer just a memory in the racing world. It had become a reference point. In quiet conversations among up-and-coming drivers, it was cited as proof that the car does not make the champion makes the car. In classrooms and leadership seminars, it was used as a case study in perseverance, control, and navigating adversity without surrendering identity. And in fan communities around the world, it marked the day when the red of Ferrari, long associated with heritage and tradition, had been challenged from within by the sheer force of individual greatness. In the months that followed, a strange duality began to unfold. Ferrari, still draped in its legacy, was now being pulled in two directions. On one hand, it remained loyal to its narrative, that Leclerc, raised in the shadows of Maranello, represented the ideal image of a Ferrari driver, young, obedient, and deeply embedded in the team's ethos. On the other, there was Hamilton, whose very presence disrupted that image with facts, not fiction. He was the outsider who refused to behave like one, the veteran whose drive outshone the team's preferred storyline. His data, his racercraft, his consistency under pressure, they all told a story that could no longer be silenced by favoritism or brushed away by excuses. And that story, whether Ferrari accepted it or not, had begun to capture the hearts of not just fans, but of racing purists who longed to see merit rewarded over manipulation. The internal divide became palpable. Certain departments quietly began shifting their support. Strategists, tire analysts, even some of the technical leads, began aligning more closely with Hamilton. Not because they were disloyal to Leclerc, but because they could no longer deny what the numbers told them. He was, by every measurable standard, outperforming expectations with machinery that was, in many cases, deliberately limited or underdeveloped compared to his teammates. There were nights in the garage, long after the paddock lights had dimmed, when junior engineers would stay back just to listen to Hamilton debrief, not out of obligation, but because they were learning. His understanding of balance, drag coefficients, tire thermal windows, it was masterful. And in those quiet moments, the truth whispered where the politics shouted. Ferrari had not hired an aging legend. They had hired a living institution, and they were failing to realize it. Meanwhile, the global media, often accused of chasing spectacle over substance, found itself caught in a rare moment of alignment. Across publications, from motorsport magazines to mainstream outlets, editorials emerged questioning not just Ferrari's decisions, but Formula One's tendency to overlook the political dimensions that influence team dynamics. Why is it that when a driver of color enters a legacy system, he is expected to conform entirely to its unspoken codes? Why is brilliance considered threatening when it does not come pre-packaged in the familiar mold? These were not racing questions, they were cultural ones. And Hamilton's Monaco drive had sparked them by simply doing what he had always done, racing better than most, with less than most. And yet, despite the growing support and the mounting evidence of mistreatment, Hamilton never changed course. He refused to weaponize sympathy. He did not demand press conferences or force narratives. He let his steering wheel do the talking. His work ethic remained unmatched, his collaboration with performance analysts deepened, and his preparation became even more precise. There were no shortcuts. Every tenth of a second he gained was fought for, not handed. And that, perhaps, is what elevated his Monaco performance into something timeless. It wasn't just that he made up positions on a track where overtaking is nearly impossible. It was that he exposed, without a single word, the invisible walls of favoritism, and walked through them anyway. What began as a setback in qualifying ended as a storm of reckoning. Monaco had reminded the world, and Ferrari, what happens when you underestimate a man whose entire life has been about proving he does not need your permission to be great? In a sport obsessed with time, Hamilton had delivered a moment that would outlast lap records and trophies. He had turned injustice into inspiration, obstacles into opportunities, and silence into statement. That is why, even as the season marched forward, Monaco never truly ended. Because some races are not measured by where they finish, but by what they awaken. As the season unfolded further beyond the ripples created by Hamilton's incredible comeback after his terrible qualifying in Monaco, the full extent of its impact became increasingly undeniable. It was no longer just a race or a single performance. It was a profound turning point in the narrative of both the driver and the team, as well as the sport itself. The reverberations extended far beyond the tarmac, reaching deep into the culture of Formula One and challenging the assumptions about how greatness is cultivated, recognized, and rewarded. In many ways, Monaco was the moment when the illusion of a seamless Ferrari hierarchy was shattered, revealing the raw, complicated reality of favoritism, politics, and human determination that exists beneath the glossy surface of the sport's most prestigious outfit. Hamilton's resilience in that race exposed the fragility of an established order and forced a reckoning that the team could no longer avoid. Behind the scenes, the pressure on Ferrari's leadership intensified. Stakeholders, sponsors, and technical directors began pressing for greater transparency and fairness. The long-standing practice of prioritizing one driver over another was no longer sustainable in a world that valued performance above loyalty. Internal memos circulated calling for a comprehensive review of resource allocation, car development schedules, and strategic decision-making processes. The era of implicit bias was confronted with the demand for meritocracy. Yet, even as these discussions took place, there was recognition that cultural change would require time, humility, and a willingness to accept uncomfortable truths. Hamilton's calm yet relentless pursuit of excellence had uncovered wounds that ran deep, not just in the team, but across the sport's broader ecosystem. On a personal level, Hamilton continued to embody the qualities that had defined his career: focus, adaptability, and an unwavering commitment to improvement. Despite the ongoing challenges, he maintained a strong bond with his mechanics and engineers, those who saw past the politics and valued his insights and leadership. His work ethic remained legendary. Hours spent in the simulator were matched by meticulous physical training and mental conditioning. He embraced new technologies and data analytics with enthusiasm, continually refining his approach to racing in an era where margins between victory and defeat are measured in thousandths of a second. His example became a masterclass not only for his teammates but for young drivers around the world, who saw in him a blueprint for overcoming adversity through discipline and grace. The broader impact on Formula One culture was also significant. Conversations about driver treatment, team dynamics, and equitable resource distribution gained momentum in forums, broadcasts, and fan communities. The idea that talent should be the sole criterion for support became a rallying cry, pushing teams to reconsider long-standing practices. Hamilton's story was frequently cited as evidence that the sport needed to evolve, not just technologically or commercially, but culturally. His ability to thrive despite structural disadvantages challenged the status quo and inspired calls for greater diversity, transparency, and respect within the paddock. As the season approached its midpoint, the unfolding saga of Hamilton and Ferrari remained a focal point. Would the team finally embrace true parity between its drivers, leveraging the strengths of both to reclaim competitive dominance? Or would internal divisions continue to undermine their potential? For Hamilton, the answer lay not in corporate decisions or public narratives, but in his own hands, literally. Every lap he completed, every maneuver he executed, was a testament to his refusal to be defined by circumstance. His Monaco comeback was not a one-time miracle, but a declaration of ongoing intent. To be recognized not for the team that had favored another, but for the champion who had refused to be sidelined. In the years to come, historians and analysts would look back on this period as a defining chapter, not only in Hamilton's illustrious career, but in Formula One's evolution. Monaco 2025 would be remembered as the race that forced a reckoning, where a driver's will to excel cracked the veneer of favoritism and revealed the enduring truth that greatness demands respect. For Hamilton, it was a testament to the power of resilience, the courage to confront injustice with performance, and the unyielding belief that true legacy is forged not by the support one receives, but by the obstacles one overcomes.